First of all, we need to put Theosophy and Christianity into context. Obviously, Christianity goes back to Jesus Christ approximately 2,000 years, and it's gone through a few changes during that period. But I'm more interested in what was going on in the 19th century at the time that the Theosophical Society came into being in 1875. At that time, there'd been a huge growth in evangelical Christianity, spurred on to a considerable extent by the desire to convert heathens, as they were then considered, by the Christian administrations running the British Empire, of which India was the crown. Theosophists, of course, wouldn't accept this idea at all. They were much more interested in spirituality of a wider nature. Of course, we need to remember that this evangelical Christianity was almost as modern as Theosophy itself, just a little older, but contemporary with it. Two founders of this evangelical movement were William Miller, an American Baptist and Adventist, 1782 to 1849, and John Nelson Darby, 1800 to 1832. He was an Anglo-Irish clergyman known for founding the Exclusive Brethren, also called the Plymouth Brethren, in 1848. Both these men are now largely forgotten, but their ideas most certainly are not. Both the modern Seventh-day Adventists and the Jehovah's Witnesses are direct descendants of William Miller, although they had separate foundations owing to the eventual failure of Miller's work. What happened there was that the end of the world did not come in 1844, as prophesied, and this was called the Great Disappointment, from which Miller's movement never fully recovered. The interpretation of the Bible in terms of dispensations, with a fascination for the end times, goes right back to Darby. What's significant is that the Theosophists today don't necessarily agree with this, but particularly nowadays, certain parts of Christianity, as we find it online, has almost been hijacked by these sectarian ideas. We can think of another American, Cyrus Schofield, 1843 to 1921, and his annotated Bible for this. It is still hugely popular among the evangelical Protestant movement of today. In fact, some people would say that no other versions of Christianity would be allowed to exist in some quarters except this one. And this is very, very far from the reality of the church. Father Andrew Demick is a contemporary American Greek Orthodox priest. He says that today, to conclude that some doctrines are true and others are false, and especially to publicly talk about it, is regarded as being living in a world usually considered to be nice. Public disagreement is usually considered offensive. And living as we do in an age of political correctness and relativism, we have been given points of cultural theology that we are supposed to profess. This is not something that Theosophists would agree with. We're not really into political correctness, and neither is he. His view is that Christianity goes right back to the apostles. They spoke his language, Greek, in the New Testament, and there's been a direct continuation of that tradition down to this day. Blavatsky, interestingly enough, was part of this Greek tradition. The modern view is that teachings about God and the ultimate nature of reality are not very important, and we don't need to discuss them publicly. Reminds me of the one where one of Tony Blair's officials said that Downing Street didn't do God. But as I say, I don't think Theosophists would agree with that. The only thing that they might agree with is that the modern thinking is that everything is relative. And we live in that kind of society. Again, I don't think Theosophists would necessarily agree with this. Another thing that's interesting is the way that even Christian writers themselves will sometimes mention the abuses that have taken place in Christianity itself. Here's a quote from a modern Mormon source. "The Bible is the most misused and misunderstood book ever written. It's been used to justify all manner of impropriety, wickedness, and falsehood. Every spiritual fraud ever perpetrated in the history of Judaism or Christianity claims support from the Bible. It has been quoted as often by devils as it has been by saints. It has served as an instrument of suppression as often as it has served as an instrument of inspiration. The knowledge of what the Bible does and does not claim for itself is important in protecting itself against misrepresentations." To begin, we need to define a little bit about how the conventional church understands it. I'm going to take a definition from the Protestant theologian and historian, Dermot McCulloch. He says, "Let's begin in Greece and not in the stable in Bethlehem." Why? Because in the beginning was the Word. The evangelist of John's Gospel gives a narrative of Jesus the Christ. It has no Christmas stable and opens with a chant or a hymn, which the word is a Greek word, logos. This is interesting because the word logos actually means vibration. And my Greek friends have confirmed this. And Theosophists understand this vibration as vash. We're actually talking about the same thing, this great urge and movement in the universe. Rather Damick wouldn't agree with Dr. McCulloch either. His perception of the Greek church is an existing community which continued down the centuries in direct line from the beginning. He says, they speak our language, Greek. They have the same continuing traditions. Speaking of the church in the first century, he would say they're our people with the original gospel, the immediate successors of the apostles, and the so-called ante-Nicene fathers, which I'll say a bit more about when I'm talking about Blavatsky in a moment. The word gospel is a church word. It literally means good news, specifically the news concerning Jesus Christ as taught by the church. Stop that time. Madame Blavatsky was something of a rebel. She would put it differently. She grew up in the Russian church, which was part of the Greek church, but while she rejected Christianity in favor of the teachings of the masters. While she did this and became something of an Orientalist, she retained a knowledge of what Christianity is in the Greek tradition. In 1888, she wrote this in reply to the Abbé Roca, one of her friends, a French priest. Every act of Jesus Christ in the New Testament, every word attributed to him, every event of him during the 3 years of his mission he was made to fulfill, rests on the program of initiation, a cycle itself found on the projection of the equinoxes and the signs of the zodiac. As I say, she wrote that. It's from her Combined Works, Volume 9, June 1888, the same time as she was writing the Secret Doctrine. To us now, at first, this might seem a strange idea. But according to tradition, Mark's gospel was written for the Romans, whose gods, of course, as we know, if we think of the days of the week, were the planets, Monday, Moon Day, through to Sunday. Bill Dalston is a contemporary Unitarian minister. He wrote a very interesting book in 2007, which developed Blavatsky's idea, particularly in relation to the gospel according to Mark, but the other gospels as well, in unexpected detail. I'll give one example. Mark's gospel is unique in that it doesn't have a birth story. It starts with baptism. But according to esoteric astrological thinking, initiation and baptism are very closely related. So he wasn't interested in the birth story. He was interested in the initiation of Jesus. The parallels go on, and he divided that whole gospel story of Mark into 12 sections relating to the 12 signs of the zodiac, which is basically a development of Blavatsky's idea. John S. Gordon, the contemporary theosophist known to many of us, said this on the subject of Jesuses. There are two such Jesus figures, or Joshua figures, known to historians. The first was Joshua ben Pantra. He was, we're told, the son of a Roman soldier called Joseph ben Pantra, who'd been seduced by a local virgin, etc., etc., etc. And he is placed probably around 100 years before Christ. What was happening here was that when Blavatsky moved the Theosophical Society in 1879 to India, she found herself in direct conflict with the missionaries of the time. In fact, it got so bad that in the 1880s, the Colombo affair discredited Blavatsky and had her decide to leave India. This was all to do with the report on what was going on in India with the Psychic Research Society, who had basically been come to an agreement with the missionaries that were Blavatsky's enemies, and she was discredited. It's only recently that Blavatsky has become more partly rehabilitated by the spiritualist movement. In 1900, the Theosophist Gerald Massey wrote in one of his essays, the Jews do not identify with Joshua ben Pandra, with the gospel of Jesus. They, his supposed contemporaries, know nothing but protest against the assumption as an impossibility. Christians do identify Jesus as a descendant of Pendra. It was he or nobody. It was whether he was neither the son of Joseph nor the son of a virgin. This again is a very unusual view. And the more we look at it, the more we realize it was quite dated. But the Theosophists have always believed, or tried to prove, that Jesus never existed in the terms of the gospel, but was based on a composite figure from about 100 years ago, to shorten it down. There's a whole book written by G.R.S. Mead, Was Jesus Born in 100 BC? With a copy of it in the Theosophical Library in Nottingham. It's one of the most turgid books I've ever read, and he comes to no conclusions. But what the Theosophists were trying to do was counterattack on the validity of Christianity, because at that time the Christians were busy trying to attack the Theosophists for all they were worth, because Theosophy always has recognized the value of Indian spirituality at a time when it was most unfashionable. The problem is that most of the Theosophists were very interested in Oriental thinking, and it developed over time. But they weren't particularly knowledgeable on the subject of Christian thinking, because it wasn't something they studied for obvious reasons. There's an interesting little passage in an obscure corner of the Old Testament. I'm quoting from the Jewish Study Bible, which is a modern translation. First chapter of the prophecies of Obadiah, verse 21. For liberators shall march up on Mount Zion and reap judgment on Mount Esau, for dominion is the Lord's. Now, what on earth am I talking about here? First of all, the word translated liberators is Yeshua, which is the Aramaic and Hebrew name for Jesus. When we're talking about Mount Esau, we're talking about the Edomites, which were another tribe. In fact, it was the tribe that the King Herod the Great, who was put in by the Romans, actually came from. King Herod wasn't even Jewish. And why I'm quoting this is that at the time of Jesus, the first century of the Common Era, the name Yeshua, or liberator, or savior, was very, very popular indeed. We now know from biblical archaeology in Jerusalem, loads and loads of people were called Yeshua at the time when he was said to be born. And part of it was the unpopularity of the foreigner King Herod. This undermines the views of some of the older Theosophists that I've just quoted, because there were so many possibilities called Jesus. Their arguments about somebody born 100 years ago, prior to Jesus, were somewhat weak and not well thought out. I want to look now at some of the ideas taught by Madame Blavatsky, which some of you may not be familiar with. She says this: as to Peter, she's talking about the first pope, biblical criticism has shown that in all possibility, he had nothing to do with the foundation of the Latin Church at Rome, other than to furnish a pretext so readily seized on by the cunning Aeneas, endowing the church with a new name based for the apostle. Now, this is where I'm going to talk about the pre-Nicene fathers, because this is one of them is Aeneas. He was a bishop in the 2nd century and one of the earliest sources we've got on Christianity. Wrote in Greek, was a Greek bishop. But the interesting thing is, Blavatsky, who understands this stuff and has read it, doesn't credit him with particular value or significance. This is part of her innate rebelliousness. She talks about Petra, or Cephas, meaning a name which is a play upon words, and it is to do with stones. She says it's a play on words connected with the Petroma. It's a pair of stone tablets used by the Hierophants for initiations during the final mysteries. This is the secret of the Vatican's claim to be the seat of Peter. As already quoted in Isis Unveiled, which is volume 2, page 92, In the Oriental countries by designation, Peter in phonetic and Chaldaic could mean an interpreter. The successors of to the title of Peter were hierophants, but hardly the successors, least of all, to the doctrines of Christ. There was an Oriental church, older and far older than the Roman one, which faithfully hung on to the teaching of the apostles. It's known historically to have refused to allow the Latin church to take control. She's agreeing here with what the Greek priest I referred to at the beginning, Father Dominic, is talking about. She doesn't want to go into great length in repeating. I'm taking this actually from volume 3 of The Secret Doctrine, compiled by Blavatsky. It's volume 14 of the Collected Works. And she goes on to say that the words Peter, Pater, and Pitta are explained going right back to the ancient Egyptians in the 11th dynasty, 2782 BC, which it's shown that came from something even older in the 17th chapter of the Book of the Dead, 4500 BC, or 496 years before the world's creation in the chronology of Genesis, followed by Usher. Paterefsu was one of the words in the mysteries, frequently mixed up with a whole series of various interpretations from monuments 4,000 years old. The Hebrew pater, P-A-T-A-R, which occurs in the history of Joseph as a specific word for the interpreter, also pitron, from the interpretation of a text or a dream. The old root PTR was particularly interpreted to relate to another word, similarly written in hieroglyphics on stele. It all means illuminator, which is more correct. However, as it may be, the word pater or Peter would locate both the master and the disciple going through the process of initiation and connect them. Thank you. Connect them also with what's known in Tibet as the initiating Lama. Whether the above terms are due simply to coincidences or otherwise is left to much more learned people, symbologists and philologists, than we are. She says she's stating facts and nothing more. She goes on to say other writers who are much more learned than she is, or has ever claimed to be, have demonstrated that Peter never had anything to do with the foundation of the Latin Church. That his supposed name and the whole story of the apostleship at Rome is simply a play on terms, which was understood in ancient times in many of the countries of the world. What she's also talking about is that the church, in the terms of the Ante-Nicene fathers, wanted to justify itself, and so played on the ancient secret mysteries which the people of the period understood before Christianity became legal under Constantine, remember. But we now, of course, know nothing about. Another thing we need to think about. That's down. Right. And she claims at one point that Peter died in Babylon. This is actually debatable, because a lot of it is to do with different sides scoring points off each other, to be absolutely honest. What's changed since Blavatsky's time is that 100 and odd years ago, you hardly ever got any Jewish sources mentioning Jesus Christ at all. In modern times, as we've become a little bit more tolerant, perhaps, a little bit more understanding, because a lot of research has been done that was unknown in Blavatsky's time. I mean, I often wonder what she'd have made of the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi Library, which are genuine things from the period that she's writing about, which were unknown to her in her day. It's fascinating if she was able to comment on these things. The Jews have become far more tolerant of Christianity in some ways, particularly the Kabbalistic Jews of today will write things like a first century rabbi once wrote, and then quite happily quote the Lord's Prayer. They don't mention Jesus Christ by name, but they're happy to include him nowadays as one of theirs, which is a big change. Now, an interesting thing too is that we need to think about was that within the Bible itself, it's clear that Jesus saw himself as a Jewish reformer and not as much as the founder of a new religion. That came later. Jesus said at one point, and behold, a Canaanite woman from the borders came out crying aloud and saying, "Have mercy on me, O my Lord, Son of David. My daughter is seriously afflicted with insanity." But he did not answer her. The disciples came up to him and urged him, saying, "Dismiss her, for she keeps crying after us." And he answered and said to them, "I am not sent except for the sheep which went astray from the house of Israel." In other words, his main mission was Jewish. That's from the Aramaic text of St. Matthew chapter 15, verses 22 to 24. But he did, of course, Jesus being Jesus, relent, talk to her and sort her daughter out. But that's a different thing. It's important that Jesus saw himself as slightly bigger than his original. So this moves on to the next point, which is that St. Paul was the real founder of present Christianity. And the interesting thing with him is that he was an initiate into the Jewish side of the mysteries which existed in that period. The clue on this is that he was a tent maker. And the tent was one of the words they used for the temple. The people who dealt with temples were the initiates. You get the same thing with the mythology surrounding Solomon's temple in Freemasonry up till today. You've got to read the Bible in slightly coded language. Paul was an initiate. He got into awful trouble several times. He had to be let down from the walls of Damascus in a basket because they were going to kill him for what he was up to. He let strangers into forbidden parts of the temple at one point in the Acts of the Apostles. But he got away with it because he was a Roman citizen and they had certain privileges gone to him. He was the person who set up church Christianity. The disciples were first called Christians at Antioch, as the Acts of the Apostles tells us, and they were not called so before. or a long time afterwards. This is Blavatsky again from the same source in volume 14. Before that, they were simply called Nazarenes. Now that's important because Nazarene, we think of it today as something to do with Nazareth, the town in northern, the thing in northern Israel. And the conventional story is that Jesus was a carpenter from Nazareth. But it's actually very unlikely. If you look at Jewish sources, first of all, Nazar means dedicated, a person who lived a vowed life of intense spirituality. The other thing is that Nazareth, the place, may not even have existed at the time that the church thinks it did. They wanted to make a nice story about Jesus being a carpenter to fit into medieval sort of ideas of family life. And again, Blavatsky is quite scathing about the anti-Nicene fathers. Such men as Irenaeus, Epaphras, and Eusebius have transmitted to posterity a reputation for untruth and dishonest practices, that the heart sickens at the story of the crimes of that period. She's not mincing her words here, is she? All the more so, since the whole Christian scheme rests upon their sayings. But now we find another corroboration, and this time on a more perfect reading of biblical glyphs. In the source of measures, we find the following. It must be borne in mind that our present Christianity is Pauline, not of Jesus. Jesus in his life was a Jew, conforming to the law. And even more, he says, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat, and whosoever they command you to do, observe and do. And again, I come not to destroy, but to fulfill the law. Therefore, he was under the law to the day of his death, and could not, while in life, abrogate one jot or tittle of it. He was circumcised and commanded circumcision, but Paul said that circumcision availed nothing. We're talking here about the great debate in the book of Galatians in the New Testament. And Paul changed his name from the Hebrew Saul to the Greek Paul. Saul was under the law, but Paul was freed from it. The real reason why Paul is abrogating the law can be found only in India, where to this day the most ancient customs and privileges are preserved in all their purity, notwithstanding the abuse leveled at the same. There's only one class of persons who can disregard Brahminical institutions, the caste included with impunity, and they're the perfect swamis, the yogis, who have reached, or are supposed to have reached, the highest levels of understanding, that of the full initiate. Paul was undoubtedly an initiate. In Isis Unveiled, she says, take Paul and read the original that is left of him attributed to this brave, honest, and sincere man, and see whether anybody can find a word to show that Paul meant by the word Christ anything more than the abstract ideal of a personal divinity dwelling in man. For Paul, Christ is not a person, but the embodiment of an idea. If any man is in Christ, he is a new creation. That is, somebody reformed after initiation, for the Lord is spirit, the spirit of man. Paul was the only one of the apostles who understood the secret ideas relating to the teachings of Jesus, although he never met him. But Paul himself was never said to be infallible or perfect. There's another interesting thing here. The esoteric and Gnostic teachings of Jesus can be found in the Pistis Socia document. This was translated by G.R.S. Mead, Blavatsky's secretary, just after The Secret Doctrine was written in 1889. And in fact, Blavatsky devoted the last couple of years of her life to an extensive commentary on it. This is one of the first of the esoteric teachings of Jesus to come forward. It's interesting that there's one reference in The Secret Doctrine where she speculates about it because she knows about the manuscript but hasn't read it. But she corrects herself when she works on it. Because Blavatsky was always a person to say, please forgive me if I make a mistake. I'm doing my best here, but I might get something wrong. She says that right at the beginning of the monumental Secret Doctrine. But it's interesting that her work on the this Gnostic material was open to correction. The advantage is in the last 100 years, we've come across loads of it, which gives us a much clearer picture than ever she or any of the Theosophists had. This is it. Annie Besant wrote an interesting little book published in 1912, Esoteric Christianity. She says there are two schools of thought at the present time, bitterly opposed to each other, and they dispute over the story of the great Hebrew teacher. What she's talking about is the difference between the ordinary teachings of the church and the esoteric understanding as it related to the pagan mysteries. It's the same theme that she uses, that Blavatsky used. But the difference between the two of them was that Annie Besant belonged to a generation of people for whom a non-Christian world was almost unthinkable. She was halfway between being a Christian and a Hindu all her life. One of the examples of this is that in the healing ritual of the TOS from 1909, she uses language which is very reminiscent of one of the collects from the Book of Common Prayer when she's talking about the welfare of animals, but then ends it with Om. She's quite happy to make that kind of fusion. And the interesting thing is, having worked with that particular ritual for some time, it actually works and works really well. So I can't criticize her too much for her rather strange ideas. She again goes back and talks about the early Christian fathers and their links with the mysteries. The difference is that she's less hostile than Blavatsky was. She says, the esoteric school is opposed by the believers in Orthodox Christianity, who declare that the whole story of Jesus is history, unadulterated by legend or myth. But she goes on to suggest that the influences of India and of paganism stand under the Gospels more or less in the same way as Blavatsky did. What of the future? The Christian church is now in flux, but the spirituality that we get in Theosophy is, to me, something very much for the future. I think when the masters were writing 130 odd years ago, they weren't writing for their current period. They were writing for us. We're moving into the age of Aquarius. And one of the things about the age of Aquarius is the age of the Holy Spirit and the second coming of Christ in the heart. And we can leave some of these sectarian divisions of the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries behind. Let's see more about the true brotherhood, which is what Christianity claims it believes in, as does Theosophy and most of the other great religions. That's my view. I hope I've cast a bit of light on Christianity and its relationship with Theosophy as food for thought. Thank you very much.